evil wins. And yet, God, underneath what your word says are the everlasting arms. It might shake, but it's not going to fall apart. There might be a flood, but it will be a season. And there will come a time of rejoicing. And even in death, oh God, there is life everlasting for those who know you, have trusted you, and have walked with you. There's an awesome final assurance that we are yours. So many things in our life we can't anticipate, and yet, God, in the midst of it, we can find you and know that you are near. And we bless you for that. And so, God, today in this service, I pray, oh Father, let us hear your voice. Spirit of God, let us hear your voice, which speaks personally to each one individually. And we thank you, God, for all of it in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Awesome. Well, I have a message that's been stirring on my heart, and I'm excited about it, and I'm hoping you soon will be. We've been studying on the east side in our older folks' adult studies over there for the last couple months, the book of Daniel. And as we have pressed into Daniel, and I will tell you this, I've been studying it like crazy. I have a brand new appreciation for the book of Daniel and for Daniel himself and why God has put it together in the way he did. And I want to share that with you this morning. And I want to speak in this fashion. I gave a long title to this message. Feeling forsaken, frustrated and forsaken, or God actually has a plan. It's easy to get overwhelmed in a culture and society that has what we have, because any little glitch can shake comfort, convenience, plans. And yet, who are we really? And so here's what I want to do. I'm going to give you a synopsis. If you want to go through it, you can. But you'll find everything that I'm going to tell you in the book of Daniel, and we're going to cover the whole book this morning. Can you believe that? That's why we're not going to read it. We're going to talk about it. And so I want to do that. But I just want you to I want you to think about this from this standpoint. I want to compare my circumstances with Daniel. I want to see through the lens of Daniel, not from hindsight, but from experience after experience, bringing it from the front, having to live through it. You know, anybody can look at somebody's life and go, oh yeah, that was awesome, that was awesome, that was awesome. But living through some of those things wasn't quite so awesome. And you know a number of the stories of Daniel. But I'll bet you there's details in almost every one of those stories that you don't really consider. So let's get started. Chapter 1. Chapter 1, there's this awesome king named Nebuchadnezzar. And he decides that he would like more land. And so he goes over to Israel and besieges Jerusalem. And in a matter of time, he takes it completely captive and gives his people, his main people in charge, the command that they should do a couple things. The first is that they should take spoil from the Jerusalem itself. And so some of the things they took were the gold and silver vessels out of the temple. And so that was one of the things. The other thing was they were to take the best of the best young men. And they were to make sure that as they came, that they were going to be completely kept separate from others and they were going to be trained in the palace for a period of 3 years. Well, obviously, you know the story that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which were the names they were given, not the names they were born with, were taken from Jerusalem and brought into the palace of the king. Now, I want you to consider this. Most would consider that all 4 of those guys were younger than the 2 that we celebrated up here this morning. Probably in the 14 to 15 range. So now they become captives, orphans, strangers at that age in a palace of a different language. How's that working for you? I mean, we just don't consider it. We hear Daniel, we go, man, that's awesome. He did some awesome things. Yeah, he endured awesome things. But he wasn't different than we are, and look at his age. So what do we know about Daniel that we just assume? Well, Daniel was separated from the womb like John the Baptist. It doesn't say that anywhere. But we know what he knows because of how he acted and what his response was in these situations. So Daniel is brought into the palace. He is given, these people are going to live in the palace with the best of the best. They're going to get all the things they need. They're going to be schooled every day in the culture and language of the Chaldeans. And they're going to eat the best food and have everything necessary, because in 3 years, he wants them integrated into the Chaldean ways, because that's how you keep these people in their place, to where if you make them strangers to their own culture, they'll never want to go back. And you're bringing people in so that there would be a trust between the people who you brought with you and those who are leading in that way. And these people were going to be servants in the king's palace in one fashion or another. You can read all that in the first chapter of Daniel. Obviously, you know the main part of the story. Daniel made friends with the guy who was in charge of all the captives. And he said, I've got a little bit of a problem here. I don't want to eat your meat and your stuff, because some of that stuff is against the very practices that our religion has. And so since we're going to be here, I just would like to tell you, if there's any way we can do it different, that's what I want to do. And so you don't have to do crazy things. Just bring us vegetables. I mean, he was strange. But no, that's what it was. You know, in King James, it's pulse. We all have one. But that's what he did. He would eat vegetables. And the guy said, oh, man, I can't do that. I mean, my job's on the line. I can't allow you guys to, you know, that would be me that allowed that. And if anything shows up, Daniel said, okay, then just give us 10 days and let's see what happens. Obviously, you know the story. In 10 days, they looked better than all the rest, and so they said, okay, if that's working for you, that's not a problem here. We got plenty of vegetables, and so they ate vegetables. But later on, in the last part of the chapter, it says that then the king began to interview these young ones in this. And it says that God gifted these 4 with wisdom and understanding in science and other things. God gifted them that. And gave special understanding to Daniel in visions and dreams. And it says that the king interviewed these guys and found them 10 times more wise than his wise men. Why is that important? Well, I'll save that for the end. Chapter 2. We just get into the heart of the story, right? Oh, by the way, I would bring attention to chapter 1. I think the capstone verse is, and Daniel purposed in his heart not to be defiled with the king's meat. In other words, there's conviction that he held in his own life that he had to adhere to, and that was something that he was going to bring out, okay? So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2. Daniel gets indoctrinated right away with his gifting, because good old Nebuchadnezzar, live forever, King Nebuchadnezzar, he had a dream that greatly troubled him. Terrible. Terrible dream. Except he couldn't remember what it was. That's a dilemma. Hey, tell me what you dreamed. It was a horrible dream, but I just can't remember what it was. So he called all his wise men, and he said, okay, I've dreamed a dream. I'm in big trouble. It shook me so bad. And they said, well, tell us a dream. We'll gladly interpret it. He goes, it's gone from me. I don't have the dream. And they said, well, then how can we interpret a dream that doesn't have a dream? He said, you know what? You guys are worthless. You're supposed to be smart. You're supposed to be the sages. You're supposed to be the ones connected with our gods. You can't tell me the dream? And then you just want to give me some phony interpretation? Is that what you want to do? Kill you all. And that's what he said. I'm going to kill all of you. Including Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so they waited and waited and waited, and finally Daniel heard about this, and he told the guy who's in charge of his guys, he said, would you tell the king that he's being a little hasty? If he'll give me a little time, I'll tell him his dream and the interpretation. You got to remember, this is in the second year of King Nebuchadnezzar, so Daniel is still quite young. Daniel prayed, and God showed him the dream. And the dream became this thing. And I'm sure that King Nebuchadnezzar, when he started hearing it, probably was going, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yes, yes. In your dream, King Nebuchadnezzar, there was a great image, very tall. And the head was gold, and then the shoulders and breast area was silver, and then in the lower area was bronze, and then it went down to where it was iron mixed with clay, and then there were toes of clay that didn't have much strength, and then a big rock was cut out, and it came and it destroyed the image. And by that time, King Nebuchadnezzar is evidently going, yeah, I see it now. I remember it now. I'm sure that's what it was. Daniel said, okay, king, would you like to know the interpretation? Obviously, he said, yes. He said, here's the deal. You are the head of gold. You're the one. You've got, this is, you're the top of the image, but these are all going to be kingdoms that come after you. And there's going to be kingdoms that, and as you see it come down, they get weaker and weaker because what they're made of does not have the authority and the power and the wisdom that you have. And you are the head of gold, but it's going to get worse. And there's finally going to come down to where it's down to toes of clay and iron mixed together. And then there's a big stone that comes, and it's going to be not even cut with hands. It just comes out of the mountain, and it's going to destroy that image, and all of it will be scattered. And this rock is going to be an everlasting kingdom. Well, we who are born in this day and born of the Spirit of God would know what kingdom that would be. There's only one kingdom that's going to last forever. The king promoted Daniel, proclaimed the God of Daniel, and told Daniel that he wants him to be kind of the right-hand guy of wisdom. Daniel said, I appreciate that, king, but could you do me one favor? And he said, yes. He said, would you also promote my 3 friends, because they have the wisdom also, and I would like to see them in these positions. And he did such. So here's Nebuchadnezzar in his second year, and Daniel's already at a very, very young age in the king's palace with wisdom. Chapter 3. After that, you would think people would learn, but you got to realize these people didn't get saved. Chapter 3, the king decides, maybe I did remember the dream after all. So he makes a great image. And it's about 90 feet tall. So noticeable. And then it's funny in chapter 3 how they have to go through the whole list of all the people, and then they have to go through the whole list each time of all the musical instruments that they're going to play, so that everybody will bow and everything will happen, and all these things. But the long and short of this is that the image is made, the music is played, And immediately the other counselors come to say, did not you say? He said, yes, that's what I said. He said, well, there are some of these who will not bow. And the names of them are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he said, bring them to me. And so they were brought to the king. And he said, is it true that you haven't bowed? And they said, yes, king, it's true. It's not against you, but we don't bow to another king. We don't bow to another god. And he said, well, I'm going to give you one last chance. I will just ask you, I'm going to give you the opportunity. I'm going to play the music again. And if you'll do what I ask, it's going to be well with you. And they said, you know the story. Most of you would. King, it's okay, but save it. You don't need to play the music again, because we can tell you right now, we're not going to bow. We will not bow to an image that is made when we have a God who we bow to, and that's the only one that we bow to. So he said, okay. And it says he became enraged and said, heat up the furnace way hotter, 7 times hotter. And it must have been a hot furnace. So he said, okay, throw them in. So they bound them and threw them into the furnace. And I'm thinking that it took like 4 guys, because each one of them would have had somebody that would have thrown them into the furnace. And the fire was so hot that the people who threw them in were killed by the fire. You're going, that must be something. The good news about that is you wouldn't last long. The bad news is it would hurt until it didn't. And then you just look at this, and the story doesn't say a lot between that time and the next thing. And here's Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, did not we cast 3 men into the fire? And they said, yes, king, that's what we did. He said, then how come I look in and I see 4 walking around unbound, and the 4th looks like unto the Son of God, son of a God? And they said, well, we have no idea. We know we threw 3 of them in there. So the king goes over to the face of the furnace and says, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, come out of there. And they walk out. Can you imagine that? You realize these guys have been in this captivity for maybe 2-3 years? They're still quite young. And they come walking out to King Nebuchadnezzar, and it says that they didn't even smell like smoke. Now, I would think that would grab everybody's attention, and it did get the king's attention. He said, Daniel, your God is the God of gods. And I make a decree, nobody will speak against the God of Daniel. Nobody will speak against that from now on. And he gave him another promotion. Chapter 4, king has another dream. This one he remembers. But it greatly troubles him because he doesn't know its meaning, and he realizes there's some stuff going on with it. And in chapter 4, it's a dream about a huge tree, and it says it stretched all the way up to the sky, and both ways that you would look, if you look at the tree, you couldn't see the end of it. Huge tree, I mean just massive tree that none of us have ever seen before. And there's things about this that I will bring out in a little bit, but we need to rehearse this story. So he calls for his wise men and gets no interpretation. And it's interesting at this one because it says then, I believe this is the one, I'm pretty sure, let me make sure. I was thinking this is the one where they wouldn't interpret. And yeah. So Daniel is finally called. Let's just cut to the chase. Daniel is finally called. the indication is that he hesitated. And he didn't want to say the dream's interpretation right away, because the king did tell him the thing, because the dream was that the tree was so big, and yet there was a watcher from heaven. In other words, it was somebody who had, they would have been a spiritual person come into the focus in this thing. And he said, cut down the tree, cut it off, and let its branches be taken down. And then after that, take some iron and some banding and put it on the stump, and in a sense just make it so it can't grow, and or can't go away, but can't be moved. And out of all of this, he said, and let a season of let a season of sevens come into this. And so he's telling Daniel about this dream, and so Daniel comes in, and the reason he hesitates is because he knows the interpretation. What if the king doesn't like it? Because it's going to be about the king, and it's not going to be good. And that's probably why all of his other people wouldn't say anything, is because even if they did know the interpretation, they weren't going to say it. Because all he's got to say is off with his head. So he says, "O king, I'll tell you what it is." He said, "You are that tree. You have grown, your kingdom has grown tremendously. This is what it is. And it has been, every place you've gone, you've won, you've conquered, you've made it big." But he said that watcher that came has been watching. And he says, you're going to be cut off. And he said, here's what's going to happen. It says that you will have a heart of a man that turns into a heart of a beast, and you will be driven out of the place where you have power. And you will be like a beast in the field for 7 years. And you're going to eat grass, and you'll be chased and driven. But then after 7 years, you'll return. And if you've humbled yourself before God, he's going to give you your position back. Well, that seems crazy. But the king heard the interpretation and let Daniel live. And what's interesting, if you read this story, and this is the part you might not know, that it was 12 months later, it says, a year later, the king walks into the palace and says, "Look at my kingdom and what I have done and what I possess." And immediately a voice from heaven says to him, "Your kingdom is done." And immediately he was changed into a beast and had to be driven out. And it came to pass exactly what Daniel had said a year before. And so when you see this kind of thing, you're just going, wow, this is crazy. Unless you're God, and then you've got a plan. But I'm just looking at this and going, how in the world does a Daniel operate through these things at the age where he's still under King Nebuchadnezzar? I mean, this is still the first king. He's going to end up being under 4 kings in his prophetic work. After 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar, if you want to read something, read chapter 4 at the end. And Nebuchadnezzar just gives a long speech about how great God is, the God of Daniel, and how wonderfully he has worked, and blessed the God of Daniel, and talked over and over about how this thing operated in his life and how perfect the interpretation was. And now that he has returned, Daniel has proclaimed these things. And they waited for him and gave him his position as king back, fully restored. Chapter 5. Different king, King Belshazzar. Who is he? He's the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And you know how it is. One king conquers and has great strength and wealth, and the son comes in and doesn't appreciate it that much, and so he likes to do what he likes to do. And so it says that King Belshazzar gathered 1,000 of his lords. Now, I believe that doesn't mean his government people. I believe it means his largest wealthy landowners. And so he's going to give them, if you want people to have the expression of your love and appreciation and acceptance, well, do it with the powerful and the wealthy. And if you keep them on your side, you know, we aren't the first culture of politics. They had politics back then too. They know how to operate and how to schmooze people into being, you know, your people. And so that's what the king did. And he had his princes alongside and his wives and concubines also there. But these were 1,000 of his lords. And he gave a great feast. And then he did something else. He called his servants to bring in the gold and silver vessels that were brought from Jerusalem from out of the temple. He said, let us drink out of those vessels, and we'll drink to our God out of those vessels. And for those of you who know the book of Daniel, as soon as that happened, there was a visible finger of God with a hand that began to write on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Nobody could understand it. Nobody knew what it meant. They were all astonished, it said, and the king called for people, and all the people were in an uproar because everybody saw the finger that wrote on the wall and engraved it on the wall. And yet, what's it supposed to mean? And yet, we've never seen anything like that before. I think it would get your attention. No one could interpret it, and so the king promised great reward to anyone who could. And then his queen said, O king, I have heard of one who has the ear of God and hears and knows. And maybe he can have the interpretation. And he called for Daniel, and Daniel came in and said, King, I do know the interpretation of what that says. It says that you have been weighed in the balances and found lacking, wanting, and that your kingdom will be taken from you. Well, the king, not to be intimidated, you know, says, bring robes and put it on Daniel, and bring jewelry and put it on Daniel, and we're going to reward him for being able to interpret what is on the wall. And yet that very night, the Medes and the Persians killed Belshazzar, took over the kingdom, and it was done. That's chapter 5. Chapter 6, new king. Darius or Darius, whichever way you want to say it. I didn't ask him. Immediately, evidently the stories have come forward about Daniel, because it says Daniel had great favor with this king. And the king would listen to Daniel. And so in the time of this, he had 120 princes to help govern, and over those 120 princes were 3 presidents. And Daniel was the chief president. He was the highest of the presidents under the king. So actually, Daniel would have been second in command and one of the 3 presidents over 120 princes over the provinces that the king ruled over. That's the way it would give it. And so, obviously, there's something that happens. Who was it that brought accusation or tried to do something? It was the other princes and presidents. Why? Well, here's this Jew outsider in the Chaldean palace under King Darius, and he shouldn't be there. We should be there. We are natural born here. We are the ones who should now be in charge. And Darius, come on, don't you recognize who we are? Shouldn't blood be thicker than water? So they formed a plan. And the plan was, well, let's just find something that's wrong with Daniel, and we'll tell the king, and he'll be removed. Well, it says very clearly they couldn't find one thing against Daniel. So they had to make something against Daniel. And so they went to the king, and you know the story pretty well probably. They said, "Go, king, we believe so strongly that you are the most important person, and you, O king, should not have any rivals at all. And so we say for the next 30 days, you should make a law that nobody can pray to any god or any image for the next 30 days. Well, they knew what they were doing. They knew what Daniel was and what he did. And so the king said, well, that sounds reasonable to me. So the king signed the decree. Shortly thereafter, they come back to the king and say, oh king, live forever. You've got a problem. You know your president, Daniel? He is unashamed to pray 3 times a day, and he openly bows himself to his God, even though you have signed a decree. And the king immediately lamented that he had signed the decree. But the truth was that Daniel knew that the king had signed the decree and yet prayed in front of his window 3 times a day. These are puzzles for me. The king said, Daniel, I've got to do what I said I was going to do. And so he had him put into the lion's den, but not before he said, Daniel, I trust that your God can keep you from the mouth of the lion. The king didn't sleep that night. And early in the morning, it says, he went out to the lion's den and said, Daniel, was your God able to keep you from the paw of the lion and the mouth of the lion? And Daniel said, O king, live forever. The angel of my God has come and shut the mouths of the lion, that they did not bother me at all. So he ordered him brought out of the lion's den, and immediately said, now, all of the other guys who accused him, bring them and their children and their wives and put them into the lion's den. And they did, and all of them were annihilated in the lion's den. And Daniel, again, was promoted by the king, made a decree that Daniel's God was God and that nobody should speak against it. So let me move along a little bit, because I don't know if you know the parts of Daniel. The first 6 chapters are experiences. The last 6 chapters are visions of Daniel. And so we take it that the first 6 chapters are chronological things that happen because they move with the kings, okay? In the second 6 chapters, you'll find that, there's, when Belshazzar was king, he had this vision. When Darius was king, he had these visions. And then he goes into where he had visions under the 4th king, Cyrus. And so when you see the study of Daniel, and this is what intrigues me. I've never been more intrigued with this book than I have been in the last 3 months of study. Because you see, when I look at what God is doing, in my opinion, we tend to separate what God has done in the past from what we think the way God works now. And I mean that sincerely. Somehow God's going to come through in our day. Somehow God's going to come through. And yet I'm going to continue to do what I want and trust God that he's going to come through. And I look at this book of Daniel, and not only am I intrigued by it, I am humbled by it. Because when I look at, let's say 14 years old when he gets taken, I think most of us can put a face and a name to a 14-year-old kid somewhere. Who in here is 14, or who's got a child that's 14? Few of you. Imagine them taken from parents, out of their place of safety, never to see their parents again probably, taken into a strange land, told that they are going to do this, and this for the next 3 years. And then you're going to be in this palace serving the king. I can't imagine that. It's not like, who wouldn't be intimidated? Why wouldn't Daniel say, "Where is God? I thought we were your people. How come you let Nebuchadnezzar come and take our city and our children? How come you allowed us to be taken from our family? How come you allow circumstances that seem like there's no advantage here? Why is this happening to us now? What did I do wrong? I'm only 14 years old. You want to give me a break here? Don't I deserve to have my family?" In chapter 1, it says the Lord gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Oh, God doesn't have bad things happen. It's never God that does these kinds of things. Well, I want to tell you, I don't believe that for 1 second. And that's probably too long. And I'll tell you why. It's because if I could see the big picture of what God wanted to do, I wouldn't consider myself first. But the problem is, if I don't see the purposes of God, then I tend to see myself first. My circumstances, my hardship, my unrealistic expectations. And I sincerely believe that we in the Christian community in this nation fall into that category over and over and over again. I do. God, you could have worked it out this way and it'd have been much better. All that says is, I obviously don't see the big picture. We talk about killing 2 birds with 1 stone. God kills 12 birds with 1 stone. And here he is. And he's going to move these people because he knows who he's going to send over there. He knows who's already been brought up into something that is so firm in his heart by parents by 14, 15 years old that this kid has a courage in him that most don't have. We would think it'd be hard for a 30-year-old to be taken into captivity who sees life and has had a grip on life and be taken into captivity, and now you're going to do this, 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 and this. You're going, okay. But Daniel evidently knew his God. He had mature conviction and determined to not defile himself with the king's meat. But what God wanted to do was influence the world powers with someone he could trust. God needs people who understand and realize the influence they have can be used. And I want you to hear this. Circumstances should never become our excuses for not serving the Lord. Ever. You know what it means when our circumstances dictate our spiritual endeavor? That we don't trust God. And that Romans 8:28 must not be true. And this is what we know. That all things work together for good to them who love God and are called according to his purpose. Do we believe that? We will gradually. But that's not easy. This is what we know. That God actually does have a big plan, and I am in it somehow, and what he will use in my life will be used for a purpose that is greater than what I can even understand, no matter how hard it is, no matter how difficult the circumstance, no matter how harsh it seems that it come. But this is what we know, that God's going to use that for a bigger purpose. That's what it says. Is that what we believe? In chapter 1, Daniel had to make a decision. Am I going to live frustrated and forsaken? Or am I going to realize that God has a plan and all I have to do is do the part that's been given to me? That's all. It's not convenient. It's not comfortable. But your choices are this: frustrated and forsaken, or trust God that he has a plan. Daniel chose the second. Chapter 2, God's going to use Daniel to do some things. And so you talk about knowing that God is God. Remember chapter 2? Hey, I've dreamed a dream. I think you've heard that before. Might have heard it sung. Except I don't remember the dream. Well, who's going to step into that? The one who knows his God. The one who's learning to trust his gift. The one who has been gifted to fill those exact shoes. Nobody else could step forward. And he waited until the threat of death made all of them susceptible to it before he said, okay. Why does that become something remarkable? Because if I'm threatened with death, I can't make it up. The king's going to know if it's his dream or not. But it also promotes him over all the rest of the people who couldn't give him the dream and therefore bring the interpretation. And so God used a young man in a way that was way over his pay grade and brought him in to the palace of the king to be separated from all the other wise men. He was brought into position and remained humble. Chapter 3 is the furnace. There are places we will not go. And I will tell you this speaks of conviction. I believe in all sincerity that God has people marked with all kinds of things that he wants them to do. But one of the things that very few will walk out is a conviction that is different from other people only because it's the obedience to the Almighty, because he has given you a personal word. I have convictions in my life that I don't speak about, because I don't think we're supposed to speak personal convictions that are not doctrinal in the church. And what I mean by that is there's doctrines in the church that everybody must adhere to. These are the laws of God. But there's convictions that come out of a personal word from the Lord or a personal idea of what God has called you to, and you put those things in line, and they are not to be broken. Them lines are not to be crossed, and they are never to even be looked at again, because that's the way God ordered it in your life. And yet I find that we as Christians in America, it's not that hard to just begin to fudge and to say, well, it's really not that bad or it's not that big a deal. And pretty soon I've even overridden some of the things that I believe God has given me, and therefore then it's not that necessity of thought. I want to tell you, we have to inspect the convictions that God puts in our heart. If I would say something to young people, I will tell you, you're in a lost world. And sometimes the only thing that's going to hold you is the conviction of the Spirit that God has put in your heart. Because all the voices around you are telling you that's not a big deal, and you're just weird. Why don't you get with it? This is a different day. It's not a different day in the Spirit kingdom. It is the righteousness of God that compels us to do the necessary things so that the next generation and the next generation will have a standard that they can operate in. Somebody has to hold it. Somebody has to be the one. And I will not bow. I would rather burn than bow. And O King, live forever. It's not against you, but you are not our God. It's a big deal. Willing to pay with my life. And yet at the end of that chapter, the king says, your God is the God of gods. Chapter 4 is about the big tree. But what's kind of the moral of that story? There may be a time when the word of the Lord is so strong and you're going to have to speak it out, and it may even defy what some others say. And you may have to tell an authority, this is what it's saying. This is what it is. And I'm not trying to say more than what I'm saying, but this is what I know from the inside. And yet what you're going to have to do is learn an approach. Jesus said, to his apostles, he said, I'm going to have you'll appear before kings and princes and rulers in this world. And don't even fret what you're going to say, because at that time, I will give you words to say. What do you have to do before you get there? You have to trust the Word of God that what He said He will perform. Because if you're not going to ask ahead of time, if you're not going to know ahead of time what you're going to speak, then you're going to have to trust in that moment that that word will come to me, and suddenly it will be more wisdom than I possess. It will be smarter than I've ever been, and yet it's going to be something that will speak to the heart of the king or the heart of this person that's in authority over me, and I don't even know why. And yet if this is the character of God, how much more will He do this in our day when we have the Spirit of God living on the inside of us? If we'll cultivate the relationship enough that we can hear what the Spirit is saying to the church, like Revelation said to all 7 churches. These are real. This is what Daniel operated in, and we marvel at Daniel only in hindsight. But seldom will we think about Daniel having to walk through these days ahead and going, oh God, again? Are you kidding me? How come nobody else has to do this? You ever said that? Chapter 5. Everybody saw the finger on the wall. Everybody saw it right, but nobody knew what it meant, and then the hand disappeared. And yet Daniel's brought in and said, well, I can tell you what it said, but you know this right now. I didn't write it, I just read it. Have you heard that before? There's going to be times when you're going to have to stand alone and speak hard things because you're going to expose hard heart. Hard hearts don't receive well. And the only time that many of them will listen is when something speaks so strong against them that it wakes them up on the inside, and they have to figure out if it's true or not and how this is supposed to play out. Belshazzar had a hard heart, and it was so hard that he didn't have any understanding that when he brought those gold and silver vessels that had been in the temple of God and drank wine to their gods in that, he just blew a jealous God off of his throne, and he said, I will not stand for that. I've been patient with you. And even in that time, Daniel went to that king and said, oh, king, let me just tell you something. Your father, Nebuchadnezzar, was driven out for 7 years, and he was like a beast in the field, and you knew that. And when he came out of that, he proclaimed God as God, and there was only one God, and that was the God of Daniel, and you knew that. And yet you have defied him this day by bringing these vessels into this room. And that night, judgment came. God has lines that he's not going to allow people to cross. In the Old Testament, study the Amalekites. One time, their cup is not yet full. And then he said, their cup has come up before me. Now I will destroy them from the face of the earth, and they will not be remembered in the earth again. God doesn't play games. We do. He doesn't. He's merciful, long-suffering, patient, and all that. But I will tell you this, he's got missions for us. And if we don't recognize it, we'll end up having just a regular life with very little fulfillment. Chapter 6. Who was it that brought the accusations against Daniel? The others who are supposedly in position. They were the princes, the lords, and the wise people of the day. And what was it that drew them? Jealousy. The jealousy they had for the one outsider that had no business having the right ear of the king, had no business being in the authority he was, and the king would always prefer him. Let's get rid of him, and then we'll have a better position. Maybe we should listen to this story today. Our nation is in some of these same places. Most people will not pay the price to be used of God, but envy the few who will. In the end, truth defended by God is worth the hardship you had to endure. Oh, Daniel, was your God able to save you from the lions? Oh, king, live forever. The angel of the Lord appeared last night and shut the lion's mouth. Can you imagine that? Being in a lion's den overnight and watching nicely grown Lions pace back and forth with their tongues hanging out and slobber coming on their face because they're hungry. And they go, man, there's a perfectly good meal, but that stinking angel won't let us get there. They probably saw him. I want to switch it up now for a little bit. Because you see, that was the first 6 chapters, and I believe there's lessons to be learned from every one of those chapters, because I have no excuse, because my circumstances aren't anything like what it was for Daniel, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I've never been through that. I've not been orphaned. I've not been pulled away from family and taken to a strange land. I've never had to learn a different language and serve people that I didn't know. I never had to do that. Daniel did. And we marvel at Daniel in hindsight. But talk about killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Chapter 7, Daniel has a vision. And in that vision, the Antichrist is spoken of. The Ancient of Days, and books are open for judgment. Can you imagine that? Wonder when that happens. Well, it's still future for us. Chapter 8, verse 17. Daniel's so troubled with his vision that he said, I don't get it, I don't get it. Daniel must have been something else. These visions were so strong to him that it says his stomach turned and he couldn't keep himself, and he couldn't eat, and he couldn't do what he needed. He couldn't carry things on because it troubled him so much. And he was troubled in chapter 8 so much that Gabriel had to come and stand beside him. And he said, Daniel, O son of man, don't take this to heart. Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be this vision. So who should be paying attention to Daniel today? We who are in the end. I found it interesting. Some of you know I went to a prophetic conference a few weeks back down in Tennessee. Perry Stone. So I come a little earlier on Sunday mornings. I just like to greet the worship team and make sure things are settled. Then I go back home, and especially if I'm speaking, then I rehearse through my message and these things. But I always try, because on a different station, Perry Stone is on Sundays for a half hour, and I get to watch some of his talk. Well, today I didn't get home till later. And so I only got there for the advertisement of his current offer. Deciphering the book of Daniel. Four hours of telling us where the Antichrist will come from and some of those things, and meaningful parts of Daniel. So, you know me. I'm probably ordering. It's fascinating, is it not? But see, this is what I'm after, because I hear different ones that have brought me studies even since we've been studying over there. And they're going, it's kind of funny. I heard this guy studying the book of Daniel. Somebody else will come, this guy has a study going on Daniel. I said, then let the church hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. It must be the day of Daniel. Daniel chapter 9. Daniel's reading the prophecy of Jeremiah and going, Jeremiah prophesied, you know it, Lord, you gave it to him. We'd be here for 70 years. Well, we've been here quite a long time, and we're getting near on 70. What are you doing next? And he's repenting for all the sin that they had done. And you were perfect, God. It was us that sinned. It's us that have grieved your heart. And he repents for, a lot of verses. And then his buddy comes, the angel. He's used to him by now. Comes and stands beside him. No, I'm sorry, this one he speaks. That's a chapter 10. Chapter 9, he gets this word. Daniel, 70 weeks are determined for thy people and thy holy city. From the time that they say you can go build the wall until the Messiah Prince is cut off will be 62 and 7 weeks. 69 weeks. Great. Well, there's the promise that they're going to rebuild the wall. That's good news for Daniel because he's in captivity wondering what's going to happen next. 70 years, if Jeremiah prophesied it and Daniel was taken in captivity, that would mean Daniel would be about thinking, I'm 70-some, right? Is that reasonable thinking? Jeremiah was partly before the captivity and in the captivity. 70 years. You look at this, so Jeremiah is not very far off of that in this way, but Daniel's going, we've been here about 70 years. We know that the 1 week of years yet to come is going to be a 7-year period that is going to be given back to them. Why? Because it's prophesied. In fact, you should read Daniel chapter 9 to see what all is happening in that 70th week. Because it lists a whole group of things to finish the transgression. I mean, if you study all that, it's so fascinating. You know it can only mean one thing. And that's the 7 years of great tribulation when the Jews are the main focus of the now Messiah. And out of that will be the time that has never been before and never shall be again, the time called Jacob's trouble. That's the 70th week of Daniel, which we're knocking on the door of today. That's chapter 9. Chapter 10, the words in chapter 10, the appointed time for this vision is long. Don't concern yourself. Chapters 11 and 12 go together. That's one vision. It lists in chapter 11 lots of armies and lots of fighting. And in chapter 12, it starts out with, there shall be a time of trouble which has never been before or ever shall be again. We know immediately what that is. That's talking about the Great Tribulation. And in 12:4, it says, seal up this vision, for it's for the time of the end. That's in Daniel chapter 12:4. So you have this Daniel who was brought out of Jerusalem into captivity. You've got him brought into the Chaldeans' palace, as a teenager, and he goes through all of these things, and yet what God gave him and allowed him to become was the mouthpiece for the end times. And then when he brings this out, if you really look at it, you can take exactly what he spoke, put it in the book of Revelation, and you'll see like the little horn that comes up. You'll see the books were opened, the judgment was set, the Ancient of Days is there, and then the Son of Man comes before the Ancient of Days. There's only that time when it comes. It's in the last days and in the time of the ending of all things. And Daniel's prophesying that 500 years before John writes the Revelation. And yet God thinks it's so necessary to warn us from 2,500 years ago through Daniel, through about 2,000 years ago through John, because he wants us to know the end from the beginning, because he wants his people to be ready for the last days when the rest of the people don't